Hello, this is Amanda Moreno. I'm going to be talking about working with paradox in the chart. Um, and this will be kind of a discussion of some psychological theories and how it's relevant to evolutionary astrology. For a lot of reasons, I think that working with paradox kind of within yourself or to help your clients work with them is really important and powerful, but also there's so much paradox going on, I think, in the world today. I know for myself, there's that constant paradox of my personal life being really good and feeling like the world stage is really bad. So it seems really relevant. I'm totally open to anybody cutting in at any point and asking questions if you have them. But I think another reason that it's really relevant is the evolutionary astrology system is very much based on working with paradox. So we have, going from the Pluto placement by house and sign to the Pluto polarity point, which is essentially working with an integration of opposites. Same thing with the nodal axis. And that in itself is inherently paradoxical, but it gets kind of complicated more when you add other factors. And so we'll talk about those and kind of like imaginal techniques that can be used to deal with that. And I think when I first started working with this topic, it was back when I was in grad school, and I was recognizing that there's, so much pressure to be whole and to be one, and to kind of give off this air of being like one very ingrained person. And our society kind of teaches us that that's how we're supposed to be as well. But I think that we actually live in paradoxical bodies and paradoxical times with paradoxical psyches. So just kind of accepting that as a facet of our reality seems pretty important. So we're going to look at some psychological theories. We'll go through the astrological polarities to talk about paradoxes that can show up there, and then we'll talk about kind of some like more practical applications. So basic definition for paradox is that it is a situation, person, or thing that combines contradictory features or qualities. Another definition said a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition that when investigated or explained may prove to be well-founded or true. There's that kind of, we can hold both of these things together. So as evolutionary astrologers, we're really familiar with the basic paradox of the conflicting desires of the soul. And that can be seen as both the desire to return to source and the desire to separate from source. It can also be seen in that conflict between, Aries desires of the ego and Scorpio desires of the soul, in terms of that, one really wants the consistency of having a solid I, and the other wants to push through the known. And onto something different to transform. And so we all exist with these really basic paradoxes within us, and that creates a lot of the drama of our lives. So our society tends to be very polarized. We swing from one polarity to the other. We see things in terms of right and wrong, or truth and lie. And so a lot of that, has a philosophical basis. So if we study the context of our culture, we can kind of go back and see that, the basis of Western society, at least, has a lot to do with Greek philosophy. And this point in time where we kind of came into binary thinking in terms of like masculine, feminine, and rational and irrational. And one of the things that I loved about studying depth psychology and Jungian psychology in grad school was that it asks us to take that kind of context into consideration, but it also really supports the notion that the psyche is not inherently whole. It is inherently quite fragmented. So each of us contain multitudes, right? And if we think about this astrologically speaking, that's just, the affirmation or the reassertion that we contain Mars and Venus and the sun and Pluto and all of those facets of ourselves. And so one of the principles of depth psychology or Jungian psychology is that of the tension of the opposites, or the transcendent function. And so this is the idea that holding the tension of the opposites, kind of being in that place of accepting that I want absolute relationship and I want freedom. So that's the kind of like Aries Libra polarity, accepting that both of those things are true at once and waiting for the third thing to emerge, the third option, rather than polarizing to one or the other, is what Jung would call the transcendent function. And the kind of like academic description of that is, or the academic definition is, that the transcendent function is the psychological process by which the latent self transforms into the unique manifest self. All right, so what does that mean? The transcendent function is the process that makes the transition from one attitude to another possible, or one belief to another possible, or one stage of life. So like the transition from being, a mother with several children at home to a mother whose children who have all left the home, right? And so this kind of gets back into that thinking in our society, which is that if you allow your identity to shift, or you allow your beliefs to shift, there's something wrong with you. Like we have this fear of being proven wrong. And it's kind of indoctrinated into us that, after the age of 7 or 8, we should no longer be spending time in the imaginal world. We should no longer acknowledge that we have these kind of conflicting parts of ourselves, because that's a sign of immaturity. And so in this process of kind of reclaiming a more polycentric or polytheistic psyche, we're giving kind of some room for the fact that we do shift, or that all things can be true at once. And so, venturing into that process of transitioning the polarity, of refusing to go to one side or the other of a polarity, our ego has to have a lot of strength. Or we have to have a lot of faith in ourselves and our processes in order to kind of hold that tension, because it's scary to not know exactly who we are and what we believe. And so another facet of this is accepting that ego identity. And I'm using ego here not in the sense of like overblown ego or egotism. I'm using it in the sense of like ego being the part of the psyche that helps us to orient to our experience. So I'm Amanda and I live in Seattle, and therefore this, and this is true, right? Where it gets tricky is that ego in our society has kind of been conflated and made to be the center or the only thing that means anything, when really the ego identity is just part of what's going on in the psyche. And so this brings us into the kind of, well, let's see, where do I want to go from here? It's kind of dense information. Does anybody have any questions? All right.
I had a question, or it may be more of a comment. What you had mentioned earlier about waiting for the third option. And the first thing that came to mind to me was that sounds like the T-square.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that I have that kind of written at the end of my notes when we're looking at the more astrological structures of it. But working with T-squares is a great way to kind of address these things, because that planet at the T is really something that is, taking the tension from both of the opposites. And then, the way that I tend to work with T-squares is that, you have the planets in opposition, and then whatever planets at the T or the square, if you can imagine it kind of like going into the opposite house, that's a really good outlet for that creative energy. But we'll talk a little bit more about how to more concretely work with that towards the end. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So bridging into kind of working more concretely with this, we have to bring in the concept of imagination, or the imaginal. And, Carl Jung and James Hillman and people that are associated with those schools of thoughts do a really great job of bringing a more visceral experience or a nuanced experience of the imagination to the forefront. And that's important because we're dealing here with the unconscious and the conscious minds. And in order to kind of like bridge that gap between polarities, you need to listen to what the unconscious is saying. And the unconscious speaks through symbols, it speaks through the imagination. And so learning how our own unconscious speaks to us through the imagination is really vital work for bridging these gaps. And a lot of times when we think of imagination, we think of like fairy tales or like seeing things. And, you know, in this sense, imaginal techniques are dealing with images, which can be visual, yes. So, you know, you might do some of the exercises I'm going to propose and like actually see things in your mind's eye. But they're more often than that kinesthetic. So they'll bring up emotions. They're felt. So there are places in the body that will have our attention brought to. They can be colors, they can be sounds. And so it's knowing that the imagination speaks to us in all of these different ways. And so, for example, if I were working with a T-square, I might imagine myself standing on the planet that's at the T. And then just invite my imagination to speak to me. And I might, you know, sense the emotion of frustration. All right. And then I'm like, where am I feeling frustration in my body? Okay, I'm feeling it in my solar plexus. So I'm just going to lean into that. What does it feel like? I just want to grip my teeth. And then a memory might come back of, you know, being a child who was 5 years old and really, really frustrated. And so in that way, the unconscious is trying to link us to the parts of our experience that have been relevant or that need to be cleared or what's unresolved. And so it's just a matter of being open to the different ways that can happen. And, you know, one of the reasons that our society puts so much importance on black and white, right or wrong, is because those spaces that we're talking about with imaginal techniques and the imagination and a more polycentric version of the psyche, it's really ambiguous. And it's not anything that can be concretized into, you know, processes and procedures that are relevant for each individual person. And so in working with paradox with clients or with yourself, it's having that openness to how the truth is revealed for you or them, rather than going straight to notions of like what's right or wrong based on kind of like left brain knowledge. And so if we go back to that understanding that a lot of our society is based in ancient Greek philosophy, according to the ancient Greeks, or in ancient Greek physiology, the heart was an organ for sensation and imagination. And so this made imagination implicit in understanding and processing experience. And so there was still that kind of room for the left brain and the right brain. And in ancient Greece, the gods served as root metaphors for understanding ourselves. And so that's kind of what we do, or at least that's what I do in astrology as well. Again, it's that like, okay, what is my Mars doing today? What is my Venus doing today? Which part of me is that's asking for attention? And the development of kind of like the modern rational paradigm has really diminished the power of those root metaphors. And so what an incredible thing to be practicing a discipline that allows us to kind of like reclaim that as an assertion of mature growth. So let's see here. So James Hillman does talk a lot about this kind of idea of polycentric psychology, which is displacing the ego as the center, but saying it is important, but not more important than the other parts of the psyche. That's coming through a lot, I think, in like pop psychology and the ways that we reference our inner child, and that kind of like Capricorn Cancer polarity of needing to self-parent, for example. So what does my inner 5-year-old need today? But in that polycentric psychology, the function of the ego becomes partially one of recognizing the multiplicity of experience, right? It's important to have that ego container to like integrate experience back into, but it's also acknowledging and accepting that life is complex. And so that's part of what I would call a fundamental practice of working with paradox, is accepting that all these things exist within a person. And polycentric psychology is also accepting that, realism can be a developmental measure for objective reality. So is this realistic? Does this make sense? But that's not the only reality that exists. And so experiential reality is sometimes different than material reality. So for example, if you're offended by somebody and then they come back and say, oh, I'm sorry, I had really good intentions, you can say, I know, rationally speaking, that you meant well. I know, rationally speaking, that you didn't mean to hurt me, but I did feel like you were purposely, sabotaging me or aiming at me. And so there's kind of that acknowledgement that the experiential reality is different from the intended reality or the, material reality. Or that could be the same as, I know that the dream I had didn't exist in this kind of like tangible, measurable world, but my experience was that I woke up from it and I was anxious for 3 days. So in some way, those two things exist together. They coexist, the tangible reality and the experiential reality. So, well, any questions or comments there? All right. So when paradox appears in the chart, in the evolutionary astrology glossary, what it says about that is that it's telling us that conflict is emphasized. All right. So when somebody has just a straightforward paradoxical chart of Libra rising. Okay, so Libra rising is paradoxical because naturally speaking, in the natural zodiac, Aries is the rising sign. And because Libra is the opposite of Aries, having that sign rising instead sets up the whole chart in a paradoxical sense, so that each house is governed by its opposite. So when paradox appears in the chart, we know that specific conflict is emphasized and that there's a drive towards reconciliation within the soul. I always laugh because I think that if you took like a random sampling of the general public, you would see that like approximately half have really paradoxical charts and approximately half don't. Right? I'm just making up numbers here. But if you took a sampling of people who are drawn to evolutionary astrologers or evolutionary astrology, you would see that it was far more prominent for those folks to have a lot of paradox in their chart. And I think that part of that is, that's that kind of paradox existing with those challenges within us is what kind of drives us to seek ways to reconcile that or resolve that or work with that. So by seeing paradox in the chart in that way, we can see that the conflict is emphasized, we can see what conflict is emphasized, and we can see that the soul is trying to reconcile and resolve the principles and the signs that conflict. So, just kind of covering how you can see paradox in the chart. Like I said, Libra rising is a good sign. Having a south node in Taurus in the 8th house, so that's Scorpio's house, is another one. So you're dealing with that kind of like core quandary of it's not straightforwardly going from Taurus to Scorpio, it's blending the archetypes. The ruler of the north node conjunct the south node, it's pretty good paradox. The sun and moon in the same modalities but different signs, so like an Aquarius sun with a Scorpio moon or a Leo moon, because there's again that kind of tension of feeling like they're not reconcilable. Squares to the nodes, there's a lot of paradox in that, but again, it's like if you have a square to the nodes and you can see that the resolution node is the north node, there is some ease with that, but what if the ruler of the north node is conjunct the south node? So it's kind of referring back and forth. And so what that tells us is there's an integration that can happen with the highest form of those archetypes, right? So it's bringing awareness to like the shadow dynamics of each of those archetypes and to the positive manifestations of them, and then trying to choose accordingly. All right. So I think that part of working with paradoxical charts is, again, that acceptance. There's part of me that wants this and part of me that wants this. So there's that kind of like conscious recognition of it. But I think what we have to be careful about is getting into that linear, rational, left brain type thinking about it. Especially in consultation with clients, we can get really linked into the, the philosophical components of it and the, talking about it. And I think what it comes down to for me as a practitioner more often than not is stopping the chatter within myself or in my session room with my clients and tapping into intuition. And so by tapping into intuition, it's also oftentimes tapping into the imaginal realms or seeing what their psyche has to say, what images their psyche has to provide about the problem. So just as an example, I'll start with breaking it down into astrological polarities. So with Aries and Libra, we're dealing with the tension between freedom and relationship, generally speaking, or autonomy versus relationship, or independence versus relationship, or self and other, which that self and other is kind of part of the Leo Aquarius polarity too. But there's also war versus peace there. And so in the left brain way of looking at it, some compromises can be having a relationship where we can be alone together. Okay, so a relationship where like two people live together, but they have separate spaces, right? Or where people can hang out but feel like they're in their own space and they don't have to engage. It's kind of like the introvert's delight right there. Interdependence is another kind of like reconciliation of those opposites. I did a workshop once about Mars, and I was having, like, I already kind of talked about this a bit, but one of my most frequently used exercises is where I have people just like get grounded and centered and then imagine that they're standing in their own chart. And so I was having people imagine standing on their Mars, and we were looking for the imagery that would come up for that. And I had somebody who was imagining standing on her Mars, and she started imagining drowning. She was like in an ocean and she was drowning and she was trying to yell for help, but her voice wasn't working and she kept swallowing water. And so the signature in the chart was that she had Mars in the 12th house, I believe in Gemini. And so that Mars was really watery, but then taking it a step further, it was squaring Saturn in the 3rd. So there's another block to the voice that's coming through there, right? And one of the core quandaries of the chart was that she had so much water. I think it was a Pisces south node, Pluto in the 4th. And so you could see there the symbolism coming alive in that. And so I, had her go back into it and I said, what would help? And she was like, I don't know. I can't stop drowning. And I said, okay, well, just imagine that, an island. You see an island. And she's like, oh, and dolphins are here to take me to the island. And so the dolphins came and got her, took her to the island, and she pulled herself up onto the shore, and she started to dry out, right? And as she started to dry out, she was able to speak and find her voice. And so that kind of, she didn't really know her chart very well, but that was the wisdom of the chart. It was very much a dry out kind of signature, come into the Virgo North Node, come into the Saturn conjunct the Virgo North Node in the 3rd, and then use your voice to ask for help. And so it's just kind of like providing that space where her unconscious could communicate. And then there's the, active, even though she's just imagining pulling herself onto dry land, there's something healing about that at a lot of different levels, energetic levels. So then with Taurus and Scorpio, we have the tension between life and death. I think that Aries and Libra and Taurus, Scorpio are both signs of extremity. And so the polarization can be very strong there. But with Taurus and Scorpio, we have that kind of life or death, or the merging versus self-reliance. This one shows up in my in my client room all the time, with the South Node in Taurus in the 8th house, or the South Node in Scorpio in the 2nd house. And so the way that that's often worked with is this kind of like just slowing it down, first of all, because when you have a karmic story that's prone to extremity, never underestimate the power of having the client take some deep breaths. And then grounding, having them visualize growing roots into the ground. Because the emphasis here, if we're looking at, the higher octave of both of these archetypes, is self-reliance, and then kind of being like grounded and rooted in the face of the tempest, or grounded and rooted in the storm. So it's that like reclaiming inner power and inner strength, and then facing transformation from that place. And if we look at Taurus, Scorpio in terms of like sensuality and sexuality, it's moving into more embodied sexuality and sensuality rather than compulsive sexuality, right? Rather than trying to like get power compulsively from the outside through sexual activity, but instead reclaiming it from the inside. And so you can kind of like come up with images that work like that for you, and then lead your client into something like that. I mean, these are really great images to work with for new and full moons within the signs too. Again, Taurus, Scorpio, how do you ground it and center? Or, if you're dealing with times of great chaos, what is the imagery that has to do with like letting go in the barrel of the wave and then pulling yourself back out again? I tend to prefer inviting the client to kind of like show their own imagery, but there's a time and a place for anything, or for everything. Questions, comments? Okay. So with Gemini and Sagittarius, we're dealing a lot with the paradox, or the tension between the left brain and the right brain, or between knowledge and intuition, or between I know versus I believe, right? And this is one of those polarities that sometimes really gets difficult for me to kind of discern the difference between the two, but it is there. I had a client recently who had Pluto in the 3rd. And so her Pluto polarity point was in the 9th house. And she also had this, it was probably a South Node in Taurus in the 8th, but it could have been the opposite. So she had the paradoxical Taurus Scorpio signature as well. And she was talking about a romantic dynamic that was going on. And I believed that I could hear a no coming through her, in terms of she knew at some level that she needed to end the relationship. But then she would go into this Pluto in the 3rd, kind of like overanalyzing, and then wondering what he was thinking, and needing to know more about what he was thinking, and and it was just spinning out, and she was going into her head. And so I just stopped and said, I have a similar signature going on in my part. So I was like, okay, what helps me? When my 3rd house Pluto is activated, what helps me? And it is locating my intuition within my body. So I just had her take a couple of deep breaths and close her eyes. And then I had her grow some roots down. And then I said, okay, when I ask you, where does your intuition reside in your body? What are you aware of? And she pointed to the part on her body where her intuition was. And I said, okay, so just breathe into that. And know that that part of you is connected to your deepest self and knows for guidance. You can always tune into that, just feeling it. And she said, okay. And I said, all right, so now I'm just going to ask you a question, and I want you to listen to that part of you. And I said, is this the right relationship for you to be in at this time? And her voice was just like, no. She said it very strongly and clearly. And because of the Taurus stuff, she'd had a hard time through the whole session, like speaking her truth, but she just said it very clearly. And I said, okay, say it again. And she did. And I said, okay, how does that feel? And she said, it feels solid. And I said, okay. So we came out of it, and then she immediately started going back into the, well, but blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, you have the freedom to make whatever decision you need to make here. But I think there's a lot of wisdom in how your body felt and how you felt when you just expressed your no. And so with that Gemini Sagittarius polarity in particular, but I would say, generally speaking too, having your client locate their own intuition where it resides and just listening to it can be really, really helpful. All right, so Cancer Capricorn, we're dealing with the tension between the genders, mother and father, nurture and discipline. I think a lot of times both Cancer Capricorn and Leo Aquarius have to do with subjectivity versus objectivity. For Cancer, it's more the subjectivity is getting stuck in the emotional body, whereas with Leo, the subjectivity is more about getting stuck in the me place, in terms of like more of a narcissistic focus, if that makes sense. And so with this polarity, it can have to do with, as I said earlier, self-parenting. How do I find my inner mother and father? How do I find my inner kind of like caretaker? And where does that caretaker need to exercise discipline rather than nurture? When do I need a bath? And when do I need to get to work? And so there's a lot of reclaiming that goes on within that polarity to integrate it. And this is a polarity where, inner child work can come in. The example that I often use for this one is when I was experiencing Saturn through my 4th house, where my moon is and where I have a skipped step. That was when Saturn was in Scorpio. There was so much inner child work going on, and it was just, my intention had been to come into my emotional body during that transit, and I got that to a pretty large extent. But it did get to a point where I was aware that I was just getting stuck in emotions all the time, and it was really interfering with my day-to-day life. And so I would do things like I would get up in the morning and cry, and then after 20 minutes I would say, hey, Mama's got to go to work. So I would imagine my inner 6-year-old self, and I would set her up with like a unicorn and watch her go on rides and find her some friends and then go to work. So there is that kind of again, it's an inner parenting. It's that acknowledgement of the softer inner side of Cancer, but also when does there need to be structure? And I think with the gender piece, we talk about Cancer Capricorn in terms of, karmic gender switching or recent gender switching. And that's probably enough material for another session. But again, it's just being willing to think outside the box and see what your clients are bringing to the table, because it's not necessarily, going from male to female and vice versa. We can see gender fluidity there. We can see transgender there. We can see gender non-conforming individuals there. And so that's where part of the paradox is that we are, as a culture, so stuck in this notion of masculine and feminine and what it looks like and what it feels like, when really, again, we all contain both of them within us, or all of that within us. Any questions there, comments there? All right. So with Leo and Aquarius, we're getting the tension or the paradox between self and community, or individual self-expression versus tribal expression. Again, that kind of echoes into the Capricorn notions of conformity and where to break that down and where to rebel. And I think a lot of times within the Aquarius Leo polarity, we're dealing with that desire to fit in, or desire to conform. But what is that really? It's a desire to be seen and recognized, right? And it's just that in our society, we see that as if you fit in, then people will like you. And so a lot of times the theme that I'm working with in terms of integration of those is for people with heightened Leo Aquarius karmic signatures, how do they find a community of outsiders? Right? Where are the weirdos, and how can they hang out with them, or how can they find groups of people that support them as an individual? So like, if it's an artist, how do they find a group of artists to paint with, or celebrate with, or be in community with? And so the key there is recognizing when it's time to leave, recognizing when the group has served the purpose for the individual, or recognizing when the group is getting, culty and trying to consume a person's individuality rather than supporting it. And I'm trying to think of a good example there, but nothing is coming to mind. So any comments from you guys? Okay. So finally, we have Virgo and Pisces. And this is very much the tension between perfection and imperfection, right? Or differentiation and oneness. I always think of Virgo and like the really, really nervous side of Virgo as being the part that's just kind of like standing in total denial that across the circle is like this ocean of total blackness and water where everything is just looming. And so Virgo's trying to just kind of like avoid that and focus on the details and hyper focus on the details in order to kind of like get away from the existential fear and dread that comes from being across the circle from the void. And that actually comes through pretty well in a vision or dream that Carl Jung had. And I just wanted to read that. Let's see. And it says, about this time I had a dream which both frightened and encouraged me. It was night in some unknown place, and I was making slow and painful headway against a mighty wind. Dense fog was flying along everywhere. I had my hands cupped around a tiny light which threatened to go out at any moment. Everything depended on my keeping this little light alive. Suddenly, I had the feeling that something was coming up behind me. I looked back and saw a gigantic black figure following me. But at the same moment, I was conscious, in spite of my terror, that I must keep my little light going through the night and wind, regardless of all the dangers. When I awoke, I realized at once that the figure was a specter of the Brocken, my own shadow on the swirling mists, brought into being by the little light I was carrying. I knew, too, that this little light was my consciousness, the only light I have. My own understanding is the sole treasure I possess, and the greatest. Though infinitely small and fragile in comparison with the powers of darkness, it is still a light, my only light. And I really like that dream for several reasons. I think for one thing, it just kind of shows the power of listening to your own inner imagery and seeing where it takes you, but also seeing what images a client brings to a session. Again, whether it's visual like that, or, whether it's more of a physical impression, like if they have a pain that's like amping up in their shoulder blade, just having them work with that and see like what images come there or what memories come there. When I first encountered that vision or dream of Carl Jung's was when I was working a lot with the Virgo Pisces polarity. And I think that there's a lot of obvious symbolism there for that. It could be interpreted in any way, but I saw it as the figure of the hermit, which in the tarot is kind of shining the lamp. And it, and then you have kind of like the fogginess of the vision and that kind of like swirling mists behind you, kind of like pursuing you. And that can be interpreted in lots of ways too, but it also does a really good job of showing the pressure that Virgo faces to keep shining the light of consciousness, to keep, doing the great work and moving forward. in the midst of this kind of like the swirling shadow or the swirling abyss or whatever you want to call it. And as I was working with that, I was writing a paper that involved making some visual mandalas, which are, like images that are based in a circle. And I had this idea for one of the mandalas that I wanted to draw, where I wanted it to be like a mandala that was nested within a tree. And I'm a horrible artist. I love making things, but I just really have a really hard time visualizing things, first of all, but I also have a hard time putting that onto paper. And so I was like, this is going to be great. I'm going to make this tree and I'm going to do each independent leaf. And while I'm doing each independent leaf, I'm going to learn all these things about the process of making art. And it was very, very detailed and very Virgo. And I wanted like the trunk to have all these textures. And as I got into the process, I started getting really frustrated because like I could see the individual leaves in my mind, which was rare for me, but I couldn't translate it onto the canvas. And as I got more and more frustrated with the process, I finally just essentially gave up and started blotting out the leaves that I had painted. Like I just like dipped my ink in some like blue and green, or dipped my brush in some blue and green paints and just started blotting them out in anger. And I realized about 5 minutes later that what I was actually doing was creating a tree. Like the blots of color were filling in the branches that I had painted beautifully. And it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, but it was a tree. And it looked beautiful and the colors were mixed and all of that. And I just kind of laughed at that moment of release of that, all the pressure built in that little crucible of me trying to like push myself to create this perfect thing. And when I just kind of gave up and let go and gave into the flow, that's the Pisces, I created what I had initially wanted. It just looked really different than what I thought it was going to. And so there's part of this, just kind of circling back around since we've gone through the whole zodiac, there is this, again, this notion of how do we withstand the force of remaining in between opposites rather than polarizing to one or the other. And earlier I was talking about that in terms of, needing the ego to be a part of that. The ego is what helps us to reintegrate our experience. But I think Pisces also offers us some wisdom there in that, the ultimate container is unconditional love. So as we're recognizing the parts of ourselves that are in conflict with one another, and we're bringing awareness to them, and we're trying to, to learn what they feel like when that complex is being stimulated, when those paradoxes are just getting really like cranky within us, what does that feel like? And how do we not lash out based on that, but instead keep holding it? And it is that kind of like commitment to loving ourselves unconditionally, and creating those kinds of spaces for our clients where they can explore, that creates the real container for creating a third option rather than going into this flip-flopping between the opposites. And so I would say then it is, always coming back to personal experience. We can learn a lot about what archetypes mean. We can learn a lot about what polarities mean, but how does that, integrate with your own experience and your client's experience? And then always coming back to intuition. What does your intuition tell you about something? And keeping that in the mix, if not relying on it more so. And then setting an intention. Part of the container is setting an intention that the work of integrating polarities or paradoxes serves the highest and best of yourself and all involved, right? And just knowing that working with paradox is sometimes a matter of trial and error, especially when we're doing something like trying to move from Pluto to its polarity point, or the south node to the north node. The north node is the only part in the chart that is inherently inactive, right? We have to activate it, and therefore it can be really counter to our natural instincts and our experience, and so it can feel really awkward. I often tell people when we're moving, especially from like Libra to Aries, from taking the needs of others as first and foremost to standing up for ourselves with a kind of like stormy, fiery passion, you might overdo it, right? You might be an asshole to someone first as you like start to get used to what that part of you feels like. So then again, it's just bringing awareness to it and trying to come back to the center place again. All right. I think that's all of the set material I have. Does anybody have questions, comments, discussion?
Hey, this is Wendy. I just wanted to say that I really like the flow of intuition and earthiness in your talk and the whole concept of going deeper with people, and rather than just being like streamlined, archetypal, aspecty, So anyway, I can really relate to that. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think that goes to speak, I mean, for me, it's really important to me that astrology is practical and not just like magical in the sense of like people coming to an astrologer for like answers. I think that that kind of like dynamic where you're working with the client to kind of make it relevant to their own experience, and therefore handing them back their power rather than letting them project it onto you is really important. And that's where the beauty of astrology comes into me. Anyone else?
I had thought of an example of the Leo Aquarius, that paradox coming out of the Cancer Capricorn paradox, where the child is, like, say they are born into a royal family, and the child is expected to conform to, especially say if it was a female child, and she's expected to conform to find this other, not even find, but have her marriage partner assigned to her,
Mm-hmm.
where she might not even wanted to get married, or and if she was uh, assigned this arranged marriage, now expected to produce children, and she may not have wanted, that might not be her natural, or her light, her son, that she wants to be,
Mm-hmm.
but having to, have her needs of who she is, her individuality, squashed by the tribe, which is the family.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that, I mean, I think that notion of choice and self-expression comes through a lot in Leo Aquarius and Aries Libra, because the Aquarius and Libra karma is so much about the needs of others and the surrender of self for relationship or tribe. And so with Leo and Aries both, the integration comes through encouraging people to express their choices and make choices. Like, you have the freedom to choose, and for many that can be really paralyzing, right? If I choose, then I have to know what I want. Or if I'm going to express myself, I have to know what I want to express, and that can be really difficult when you've spent so long on the other side of the polarity, because it's that then you have to go through the quest of self-awareness and self-knowledge in order to get there. And that does feel very paradoxical, because there's also the longing for it, right? But then it's, how do I do it? Anyone else?
If no one else had a question, I had another thought as far as what I had mentioned earlier, as far as the T-square. Could you see it as maybe a balancing point for that paradox? I mean, because I would think I'm looking at it as like a handle, so to speak. So it would be easier to balance maybe the polarities and have somewhere to go in order to balance the polarities, as
Sure.
opposed without that T, that, that little handle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're definitely onto something. What comes to my mind as you're saying that is that I think it really just depends on the nature of the T-square, because like having Neptune at the T of a T-square is very different than having Mars there. So Neptune's going to have more of that like dissolving quality, whereas Mars will be more like support more of that like initiation to integrate them, at least hypothetically speaking. And so I think that's where things like astrodrama come in really handy, because if you have people literally acting out the different pieces of these, more difficult or complex alignments, then you see what arises naturally from the field. And you can, if somebody's like directing the astrodrama, for example, and you had a T-square with like, Venus Saturn opposition with Neptune at the square, you can ask Neptune, hey Neptune, what can Saturn and Venus do to reconcile this friction? Or where is the tension of these opposites going? It's just that open-mindedness to working with it in lots of different ways. All right. Anything else? Shall we end it here then?
Amanda, there's a comment from Carolyn in the chat. She
Okay.
says, this shines a light on my North Node Taurus in the first house versus South Node conjunct Mercury, Mars conjunct Chiron in my 7th. Thank you.
Great.
Okay. In Scorpio. South Node in Scorpio. Okay.
Yeah, it's amazing how the Scorpio Taurus and the Aries Libra axes to me are very, they are very similar, because it's so relationship versus self. And so you can really, I oftentimes am working with all four of them at once, especially when it comes to those paradoxes.
Okay. Any final questions or comments? Amanda, you do have another 5 minutes if you like. Wanda, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you, especially with someone, myself having quite a few oppositions in my chart. This was extremely helpful.
Great. I'm so glad.
And Carolyn mentions again in the chat that her sun is in Libra and her ascendant is in Aries. Very intense.
Yep.
Mm.
And I think that, what comes to mind there is something I've read in many evolutionary astrology things, which is when we're dealing a lot with the Libra Aries axis, there is a core emotion that arises between that paradox of wanting absolute freedom and absolute relationship, and that identifying the emotion that's at the crux of that, which is going to be, unique to each person. And then feeling when that emotion is arising and figuring out coping strategies for working with it is, plays a big role in integrating those opposites.
Amanda.
Okay.
Hi, Amanda. It's Carly.
Hi.
Hi. Unfortunately, my computer's been playing up, so I didn't catch the beginning of your meeting, so I'll have to watch this back, and then I'm sure I'll have many questions. But until then, I always love your work. I'm looking forward to watching this very soon.
Please feel free to email me with questions when you watch it.
I shall. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this has been a great topic. I have a paradoxical chart myself, and I've got Pluto skip steps, and the nodes are in the 7th and the 1st, and Libra and Ascendant, so I could relate to so much of it, but I really feel I've integrated the opposites within myself just fairly recently, actually. It does take it's taken a lifetime for me. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, that's that self-acceptance piece, I think.
Well, just understanding the issue, it really does help. And like astrology is great, for this sort of thing. Okay, so 3 minutes left. Any final questions? Wanda.
I did have one other thing I wanted to ask. With someone having a planet conjunct the Pluto polarity point, would that heighten that paradox?
I would probably need to think about it a little more, but to me, I think it actually helps in that case because there's some kind of like active tool. I guess it would just depend on what it is and what it's aspecting. But like, for example, if you have your sun in the position, the area of where the polarity point is, and that's somewhere where you naturally shine light, right? And so that to me seems like an asset. Whereas maybe if it was, Saturn opposing the Pluto, that could be more of a barrier or just provide a lot of strength for commitment to actualizing that point. So again, it's that like, how do we think about these things, in the context that they're presented? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, because especially there's a generation of us who actually has Saturn conjunct the, our Pluto polarity point. So that was kind of why I was asking that question.
Right. Yeah, I would look at Saturn in the context of the rest of the chart. And that will determine whether it is more of a barrier type feeling or a block type feeling or an energy to be used. Although I would say it's usually both. It's just, if it's the ruler of the south node, that's going to be very different than if it's the ruler of the north node, for example. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. That was absolutely fantastic. So interesting. Thank you from all of us, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amanda. See ya.